Hi, this is Paul. If there's one thing you've heard from Jonathan Pageau, it's this.
Now, once again, for many people, this might seem still a little bit abstract, and I thank you for following me all the way here if you've had the courage to do so. But this truth that we just talked about is true at every level of reality. It is fractally true. It is true of any object you can perceive. And so, let's what example are we going to use? Let's use a chair because it's an example that I like to use. And so, the being of the chair, right? The fact that it's a chair, the chairness of the chair is beyond all the parts of the chair. It has to be. And so it's beyond all the parts of the chair, but it is the source of all the parts of the chair as well. That is, it is the reason why these parts are even perceived as parts of the chair, themselves, and they're not seen as something else, like a bit of wood or a bit of paint or, a branch or whatever. That the fact that we see them as legs, as different aspects of the chair, is because they're held together by the identity of the chair, which is above the chair itself. And so you can't, if you say that the leg of the chair is the chair, you're lying. If you say the back of the chair is the chair, you're lying. It's not. None of the elements of the chair are the chair. And so to try to name them by their elements is to miss the basic point that the identity of the chair is beyond it. But at the same time, because the identity of the chair gives reason for these parts of the chair to be parts of the chair, therefore it fills the chair with its presence. And it makes those parts, let's say, little names for the chair. So it is a leg of a chair. It is the back of a chair. It is the aspects of the chair. And so they become like, we have to look to all the parts of the chair and at the same time see that the chair itself is beyond all the parts to be able to get the full movement of reality, right? The movement up and the movement down. This kind of, these two movements that I talk about, for example, with John Vervaeke all the time, it's kind of eminent, this emanation and this emergent reality. This is what St. Dionysius is talking about. And he is actually giving us a very powerful solution to many of the problems, whether it is complex systems or just the way in which the church exists or just in how we can interpret scripture without falling into these absolutes. The balance is difficult to find. It's very difficult to find the balance between recognizing how all forms are relative to the highest purpose, but also how they're real. And without them, you can't sit on the chair without the legs of the chair, even though the identity of the chair transcends its elements.
Okay, now you might have heard Jonathan give this little speech many times because he, in fact, has given it many times. But even though he uses all very normal words, the concept of what he is trying to get at, and you can hear John Vervaeke make similar speeches, you can listen to Jordan Peterson make similar speeches, you can find similar attempts to relay this sort of idea in various philosophies throughout the history of the world. Whether or not you see exactly what Jonathan is talking about goes beyond the words themselves. The word chair is a very common word. All of the other words that he's used are very common words. But the challenge is, by virtue of listening to all of the words, to, and this is the word we always use, to see his point. And going back to the C.S. Lewis stuff from his book Miracles, well, why do we use those words to see his point? Now, I want to bring in, like I mentioned in my after Canadian Rockies vacation video, I want to bring in Oliver Sacks's work, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. Because as I listened to that audiobook, as I was driving through the Pacific Northwest of the United States and the great and beautiful Canadian Rockies and the desert northwest of the United States, there's a lot of application of this seeing. One of the most mysterious things in the Bible is when Jesus says things like, "For those who have eyes to see, let them see," because the seeing is something that is far more complex than what, especially in late modernity, we have been led to believe.
The man who mistook his wife for a hat. Dr. P was a musician of distinction, well known for many years as a singer, and then at the local school of music as a teacher. It was here, in relation to his students, that certain strange problems were first observed. Sometimes a student would present himself, and Dr. P would not recognize him, or specifically would not recognize his face. The moment the student spoke, he would be recognized by his voice. Such incidents multiplied, causing embarrassment, perplexity, fear, and sometimes comedy. For not only did Dr. P increasingly fail to see faces, but he saw faces when there were no faces to see. Genially, Magoo-like, when in the street he might pat the heads of water hydrants and parking meters, taking these to be the heads of children. He would amiably address carved knobs on the furniture and be astounded when they did not reply. At first, these odd mistakes were laughed off as jokes, not least by Dr. P himself. Had he not always had a quirky sense of humor and been given to Zen-like paradoxes and jests? His musical powers were as dazzling as ever. He did not feel ill. He had never felt better. And the mistakes were so ludicrous and so ingenious that they could hardly be serious or betoken anything serious. The notion of there being something the matter did not emerge until some 3 years later, when diabetes developed. Well aware that diabetes could affect his eyes, Dr. P consulted an ophthalmologist, who took a careful history and examined his eyes closely. "There's nothing the matter with your eyes," the doctor concluded, "but there is trouble with the visual parts of your brain. You don't need my help. You must see a neurologist." And so, as a result of this referral, Dr. P came to me. It was obvious within a few seconds of meeting him that there was no trace of dementia in the ordinary sense. He was a man of great cultivation and charm who talked well and fluently, with imagination and humor. I couldn't think why he had been referred to our clinic. And yet, there was something a bit odd. He faced me as he spoke, was oriented towards me, and yet there was something the matter. It was difficult to formulate. He faced me with his ears, I came to think, but not with his eyes. These, instead of gazing at me, taking me in the normal way, made sudden, strange fixations. On my nose, on my right ear, down to my chin, up to my right eye, as if noting, even studying these individual features, but not seeing my whole face.
Okay, let's pay a little attention here. Faces, seeing faces. Now, we are pattern-seeing creatures, and we always tend to find faces. When my children were small, we put these little things of faces up in their crib because some article came out that said that was supposed to make them smarter. My children are all smart, so maybe it worked. But what is it to see a face? And what is a face?
It's changing expressions, me, as a whole. I'm not sure that I've...
Now notice, with Dr. Sachs, our face is us. Our faces are really important. Will come out in a number of his neurological stories here.
fully realized this at the time. There was just a teasing strangeness, some failure in the normal interplay of gaze and expression. He saw me. He scanned me. And yet... "What seems to be the matter?" I asked him at length. "Nothing that I know of," he replied with a smile. "But people seem to think there's something wrong with my eyes."
Okay, now pay attention here, because in many of the cases in this book, the person doesn't have a sense of what they're not seeing. Okay? It's the people around them that say, something's wrong here, something's going on. You should go see a doctor. I feel fine, everything's going well. I don't see, notice our language again, I don't see a problem.
"But you don't recognize any visual problems." "No, not directly, but I occasionally make mistakes." I left the room briefly to talk to his wife. When I came back, Dr. P was sitting placidly by the window, attentive, listening rather than looking out. "Traffic," he said. "Street sounds, distant trains. They make a sort of symphony, do they not? You know Onager Specific 231? What a lovely man, I thought to myself. How can there be anything seriously the matter? Would he permit me to examine him? Yes, of course, Dr. Sachs. I stilled my disquiet, his perhaps too, in the soothing routine of a neurological exam. Muscle strength, coordination, reflexes, tone. It was while examining his reflexes, a trifle abnormal on the left side, that the first bizarre experience occurred. I had taken off his left shoe and scratched the sole of his foot with a key, a frivolous-seeming but essential test of a reflex, and then, excusing myself to screw my ophthalmoscope together, left him to put on the shoe himself. To my surprise, a minute later he had not done this. "Can I help?" I asked. "Help what?" "Help whom?" "Help you put on your shoe." "Ah," he said, "I had forgotten the shoe," adding sotto voce, "The shoe. The shoe." He seemed baffled. "Your shoe?" I repeated. "Perhaps you'd put it on?" He continued to look downwards, though not at the shoe, with an intense but misplaced concentration. Finally his gaze settled on his foot. "That is my shoe, yes?" Did I mishear? Did he missee? "My eyes," he explained, and put a hand to his foot. "This is my shoe, no?" "No, it is not. That is your foot. There is your shoe." "Ah, I thought that was my foot."
Now again, notice how the good Dr. P, the musical Dr. P, not the Dr. Sachs, the neurologist, he's innocent of all of this. This is a function of seeing, and it's a sort of seeing that a toddler can manage, and that this individual managed for most of his life. Yet now suddenly he can't do it.
Was he joking? Was he mad? Was he blind? If this was one of his strange mistakes, it was the strangest mistake I had ever come across. I helped him on with his shoe, his foot, to avoid further complication. Dr. P himself seemed untroubled, indifferent, maybe amused.
Now notice also that the doctor, for all of us listening to it, imagining ourselves in the place of the doctor, if this had happened to us, we'd think, there's something seriously wrong with me. It's just simply not occurring to him.
I resumed my examination. His visual acuity was good. He had no difficulty seeing a pin on the floor, though sometimes he missed it if it was placed to his left. He saw all right, but what did he see? I opened out a copy of the National Geographic magazine and asked him to describe some pictures in it.
Now, this whole point of seeing, again, if you go back to Jordan Peterson's conversation with Sam Harris, the first one that they had in Vancouver, the entire conversation was in many ways all about seeing. And the point that Jordan Peterson wanted to make again and again to Sam Harris is that seeing is by no means the simple thing we imagine it to be. Now, for most of us, for the community of us, as we talk to one another, we can say, I see the cell phone stand, I see the lens cap, and we can all agree to these things. But again, going back to Jonathan Pageau's, I see a chair. That is not a simple thing. Again, I can pick this up into, let's say a civilization that had no cameras with no lens caps or anything like that. What might they see? They might see, well, it's a disc. Is it for a game? Is it to put a cold drink on so you don't ruin the furniture? Is it to put in your head and your lip? I mean, what is this thing? Yet we have very little trouble knowing what this thing is and all agreeing to it.
His responses here were very curious. His eyes would dart from one thing to another, picking up tiny features, individual features, as they had done with my face. A striking brightness.
And, back to Jonathan Pageau's chair thing, picking up the legs, picking up the back, picking up the seat, maybe picking up the color.
Color, a shape would arrest his attention and elicit comment, but in no case did he get the scene as a whole. He failed to see the whole, seeing only details which he spotted like blips on a radar screen. He never entered into relation with the picture as a whole, never faced, so to speak, its physiognomy. He had no sense whatever of a landscape or scene.
So in other words, this individual can't do what Jonathan Pageau just has talked about in terms of what we all do when we see the chair. In other words, in many ways, this individual in this story right here is an illustration of what Jonathan keeps talking about, but Jonathan keeps making this point, and we're all like, what's the point about that? It's a chair. We all know the chair, but Pageau is sort of taking it apart and saying there's more going on in this, and sometimes you can't see the more that is going on in this unless you see the absence of it.
I showed him the cover, an unbroken expanse of Sahara dunes. "What do you see here?" I asked. "I see a river," he said. "And a little guest house with its terrace on the water. People are dining out on the terrace. I see colored parasols here and there." He was looking, if it was looking, right off the cover into midair, and confabulating non-existent features, as if...
Now again, now he's claiming to see things that aren't there, but this isn't simply hallucination that's going on here.
The absence of features in the actual picture had driven him to imagine the river and the terrace and the colored parasols.
In other words, he was filling in these things, but where was he getting them from?
I must have looked aghast, but he seemed to think he had done rather well. There was a hint of a smile on his face. He also appeared to have decided that the examination was over and started to look around for his hat. He reached out his hand and took hold of his wife's head, tried to lift it off, to put it on. He had apparently mistaken his wife for a hat. His wife looked as if she was used to such things. I could make no sense of what had occurred in terms of conventional neurology or neuropsychology. In some ways, he seemed perfectly preserved, and in others, absolutely, incomprehensibly devastated. How could he, on the one hand, mistake his wife for a hat, and on the other, function, as apparently he still did, as a teacher at the music school?
And let's pause for that question, because it's a devastated question. He mistakes his wife for a hat, but continues to go on teaching at a music school, and not as a charity case. They continue to pay him because they continue to value him. We, as creatures, are that strange.
I had to think, to see him again, and to see him in his own familiar habitat, at home. A few days later, I called on Dr. P. and his wife at home. With the score of the Dichterliebe in my briefcase, I knew he liked Schumann, and a variety of odd objects for the testing of perception. Mrs. P. showed me into a lofty apartment which recalled Fin du siècle Berlin. A magnificent old Bersendorfer stood in state in the center of the room, and all around it were music stands, instruments, scores. There were books, there were paintings, but the music was central. Dr. P. came in, a little bowed and, distracted, advanced with outstretched hand to the grandfather clock, but, hearing my voice, corrected himself and shook hands with me.
In other words, not only did he mistake his wife for a hat, he mistook Dr. Sachs. He mistook a grandfather clock for Dr. Sachs.
We exchanged greetings and chatted a little of current concerts and performances. Diffidently, I asked him if he would sing. "The Dichterliebe," he exclaimed. "But I can no longer read music. You will play them, yes?" I said I would try. On that wonderful old...
This accomplished, and again, there's strangeness in here that just sort of gets masked over. And the degree to which he sees and doesn't see is quite remarkable, because here you have this accomplished professor of music who can no longer read music. Well, when did that drop out of your list of abilities?
Piano, even my playing sounded right. And Dr. P. was an aged but infinitely mellow Fischer disco, combining a perfect ear and voice with the most incisive musical intelligence. It was clear that the music school was not keeping him on out of charity. Dr. P.'s temporal lobes were obviously intact. He had a wonderful musical cortex. What, I wondered, was going on in his parietal and occipital lobes, especially in those areas where visual processing occurred. I carried the Platonic Solids in my neurological kit and decided to start with these. "What is this?" I asked, drawing out the first one. "A cube, of course." "Now this?" I asked, brandishing another. He asked if he might examine it, which he did swiftly and systematically. "A dodecahedron, of course, and don't bother with the others. I'll get the icosahedron, too." Abstract shapes clearly presented no problems.
Now, one of my favorite sections in this book is the section on the simple. So if you do pick up this book, by all means, if you're not going to listen to the whole thing, make sure you go to the section on the simple, because it's really amazing to get into this question of all of the complexities that we so take for granted. Now in this case, abstraction is not a problem, whereas with many of the simple, abstraction is exactly the deficit, but they make up and in some cases excel in other ways without abstraction. So there's a lot of complexity going on here. It's really a quite fascinating book.
What about faces? I took out a pack of cards. All of these he identified instantly, including the jacks, queens, kings, and the joker. But these, after all, are stylized designs, and it was impossible to tell whether he saw faces or merely patterns.
Ah. Are faces just patterns? Or does he know these patterns? And what is the deal with faces?
I decided I would show him a volume of cartoons which I had in my briefcase. Here again, for the most part, he did well. Churchill's cigar, Schnauzel's nose. As soon as he had picked out a key feature, he could identify the face. But cartoons, again, are formal and schematic. It remained to be seen how he would do with real faces, realistically represented. I turned on the television, keeping the sound off, and found an early Bette Davis film. A love scene was in progress. Dr. P failed to identify the actress, but this could have been because she had never entered his world. What was more striking was that he failed to identify the expressions on her face or her partner's, though in the course of a single torrid scene these passed from sultry yearning through passion, surprise, disgust, and fury to a melting reconciliation.
In other words, there's a lot going on in that scene, and he can't see it.
Dr. P could make nothing of any of this. He was very unclear as to what was going on, or who was who, or even what sex they were. His comments on the scene were positively Martian.
Now that's an older expression, one that has sort of passed out. Martian, of another world, let's say.
It was just possible that some of his difficulties were associated with the unreality of a celluloid Hollywood world, and it occurred to me that he might be more successful in identifying faces from his own life. On the walls of the apartment there were photographs of his family, his colleagues, his pupils, himself. I gathered a pile of these together and, with some misgivings, presented them to him. What had been funny or farcical in relation to the movie was tragic in relation to real life. By and large, he recognized nobody. Neither his family, nor his colleagues, nor his pupils, nor himself. He recognized a portrait of Einstein because he picked up the characteristic hair and mustache, and the same thing happened with one or two other people. Ah, Paul.
Now this is interesting because obviously by virtue of his long history, certain elements began to tip him off to the whole, and so he could name the whole, but what amount of grasp did he actually have of the whole, or of the whole of anything?
Paul, he said, when shown a portrait of his brother. That square jaw, those big teeth, I would know Paul anywhere. But was it Paul he recognized, or one or two of his features, on the basis of which he could make a reasonable guess as to the subject's identity? In the absence of obvious markers.
Now what's interesting here too is that, well, going back to the chair, perhaps he might recognize a particular chair by the peculiar and unique aspects of, let's say, legs or back or seats, and therefore infer all the way to a particular chair. But chairness itself, he seemed to be blind to.
He was utterly lost. But it was not merely the cognition, the gnosis, at fault. There was something radically wrong with the whole way he proceeded. For he approached these faces, even of those near and dear, as if they were abstract puzzles or tests. He did not relate to them. He did not behold. No face was familiar to him, seen as a thou, being just identified as a set of features, an it.
Now, this will be a theme throughout his book. One of the things that Oliver Sacks really tries to get at is the livingness of life and not just the mechanical elements of that. And that comes through in a number of the later chapters especially.
Thus there was formal, but no trace of personal gnosis. And with this went his indifference or blindness to expression. A face, to us, is a person looking out. We see, as it were, the person through his persona, his face. But for Dr. P, there was no persona in this sense, no outward persona, and no person within. I had stopped at a florist on my way to his apartment and bought myself an extravagant red rose for my buttonhole. Now I removed this and handed it to him. He took it like a botanist or morphologist given a specimen, not like a person given a flower. "About 6 inches in length," he commented. "A convoluted red form with a linear green attachment." "Yes," I said, encouraged.
See, there's the chair. It's a rose. We look at, well, that's a rose. That's a flower. But he's got all the elements of it. But in that sense, there's no emanation of flowerness in the flower.
"And what do you think it is, Dr. P?" "Not easy to say." He seemed perplexed. "It lacks the simple symmetry of the Platonic Solids, although it may have a higher symmetry of its own. I think this could be an inflorescence or flower." "Could be," I queried. "Could be," he confirmed. "Smell it," I suggested, and he again looked somewhat puzzled, as if I had asked him to smell a higher symmetry. But he complied courteously and took it to his nose. Now, suddenly he came to life. "Beautiful."
Now, suddenly, he sees. Or does he see? Or what does he see with?
He exclaimed. "An early rose. What a heavenly smell." He started to hum Di Rosa di Lili. Reality, it seemed, might be conveyed by smell, not by sight.
Now, reality, Dr. Sachs states. What reality is this? He was holding something in his hand. There's no change to what he was holding in his hand. But reality is where the upper and lower register meet.
I tried one final test. It was still a cold day in early spring, and I had thrown my coat and gloves on the sofa. "What is this?" I asked, holding up a glove. "May I examine it?" he asked, and taking it from me, he proceeded to examine it as he had examined the geometrical shapes. "A continuous surface," he announced at last, "enfolded on itself. It appears to have," he hesitated, "5 outpouchings, if this is the word." "Yeah."
And this was the element of the story that really grabbed me. 5 outpouchings. He can even make up a word to try to describe this thing he holds in his hand, but yet he cannot see it.
"Yes," I said cautiously. "You have given me a description. Now tell me what it is."
Now notice, what it is. What it is the nexus between the upper and the lower registers. He's trying to get at the glove through emergence, and it's going to have to be, in a sense, revelation, emanation.
"A container of some sort?" "Yes," I said. "And what would it contain?" "It would contain its contents," said Dr. P. with a laugh. "There are many possibilities. It could be a change purse, for example, for coins of 5 sizes.
A chair can be many things. But again, if I withhold the chair concept from you, well, is that what it is?
Could, I interrupted the balmy flow. "Does it not look familiar? Do you think it might fit a part of your body?" No light of recognition dawned on his face. Later, by accident, he got it on and exclaimed, "My God, it's a glove!" This was reminiscent of Kurt Goldstein's patient Lanuti, who could only recognize objects by trying to use them in action. No child would have the power to see and speak of a continuous surface enfolded on itself, but any child, any infant, would immediately know a glove as a glove. see it as familiar as going with the hand. Dr. P didn't. He saw nothing as familiar. Visually, he was lost in a world of lifeless abstractions. Indeed, he did not have a real visual world, as he did not have a real visual self. He could speak about things, but did not see them face to face. Hewlings-Jackson, discussing patients with aphasia and left hemisphere lesions, says they have lost abstract and propositional thought, and compares them with dogs, or rather he compares dogs to patients with aphasia. Dr. P, on the other hand, functioned precisely as a machine functions. It wasn't merely that he displayed the same indifference to the visual world as a computer, but, even more strikingly, he construed the world as a computer construes it, by means of key features and schematic relationships.
Now we're getting into some very interesting territory. Now, this was originally written in the 70s and had been updated through the 80s, so this is a dated book, but not that far out of date as a computer sees it, because what can't the computer see? And this then gets into AI and the question of cognition and trying to teach computers. And we've gotten to the point to have Google Photos and lots of other algorithms recognize all sorts of things. But one of the things the computer likely cannot comprehend is gloveness of the glove. It might spit out the word glove, it might spit out the word rose, it might spit out, but there is something to it that it cannot comprehend from below. It has to come from above.
The scheme might be identified in an identikit way without the reality being grasped at all. The testing I had done so far told me nothing about Dr. P's inner world. Was it possible that his visual memory and imagination were still intact? I asked him to imagine entering one of our local squares from the north side, to walk through it in imagination or in memory, and tell me the buildings he might pass as he walked. He listed the buildings on his right side, but none of those on his left. I then asked him to imagine entering the square from the south. Again, he mentioned only those buildings that were on the right side, although these were the very buildings he had omitted before. Those he
Now things are getting even stranger.
He had seen internally before were not mentioned now. Presumably, they were no longer seen.
In other words, there are things in this world that are not seen. He just, in a sense, saw them before, but they have disappeared.
It was evident that his difficulties with leftness, his visual field deficits, were as much internal as external, bisecting his visual memory and imagination. What at a higher level of his internal visualization? Thinking of the almost hallucinatory intensity with which Tolstoy visualizes and animates his characters, I questioned Dr. P about Anna Karenina. He could remember incidents without difficulty, had an undiminished grasp of the plot, but completely omitted visual characteristics, visual narrative, and scenes. He remembered the words of the characters, but not their faces. And though, when asked, he could quote, with his remarkable and almost verbatim memory, the original visual descriptions, these were, it became apparent, quite empty for him, and lacked sensorial, imaginal, or emotional reality. Thus there was an internal agnosia as well.
Okay, so there are things to this, aspects of the relationship that are unavailable to poor Dr. P.
But this was only the case, it became clear, with certain sorts of visualization. The visualization of faces and scenes, of visual narrative and drama, this was profoundly impaired, almost absent. But the visualization of schemata was preserved, perhaps enhanced. Thus, when I engaged him in a game of mental chess, he had no difficulty visualizing the chessboard or the moves, indeed no difficulty in beating me soundly. I have often wondered about Helen Keller's visual descriptions, whether these, for all their eloquence, are somehow empty as well, or whether, by the transference of images from the tactile to the visual, or, yet more extraordinarily, from the verbal and the metaphorical to the sensorial and the visual, she did achieve a power of visual imagery, even though her visual cortex had never been stimulated directly by the eyes. But in Dr. P's case, it is precisely the cortex that was damaged, the organic prerequisite of all pictorial imagery. Interestingly and typically, he no longer dreamed pictorially, the message of the dream being conveyed in non-visual terms.
Now that's fascinating, because just try to think about that in terms of your experience with dreams.
Luria said of Zazetsky that he had entirely lost his capacity to play games, but that his vivid imagination was unimpaired. Zazetsky and Dr. P lived in worlds which were mirror images of each other. But the saddest difference between them was that Zazetsky, as Luria said, fought to regain his lost faculties with the indomitable tenacity of the damned, whereas Dr. P was not fighting, did not know what was lost, did not indeed know that anything was lost. But who was more tragic and who was more damned, the man who knew it or the man who did not? When the examination was over, Mrs. P called us to the table, where there was coffee and a delicious spread of little cakes. Hungrily, hummingly, Dr. P started on the cakes. Swiftly, fluently, unthinkingly, melodiously, he pulled the plates towards him and took this and that in a great gurgling stream, an edible song of food, until, suddenly, there came an interruption. A loud, peremptory rat-tat-tat at the door.
Now notice, he seemed to recognize the cakes, he seemed to recognize food, he could do all that.
Startled, taken aback, arrested by the interruption, Dr. P stopped eating and sat frozen, motionless at the table, with an indifferent, blind bewilderment on his face. He saw, but no longer saw the table, no longer perceived it as a table laden with cakes. His wife poured him some coffee. The smell titillated his nose and brought him back to reality.
Brought him back to reality. What reality is this? Where was he when he was not in reality?
The melody of eating resumed. How does he do anything? I wondered to myself. What happens when he's dressing? Goes to the lavatory, has a bath. I followed his wife into the kitchen and asked her how, for instance, he managed to dress himself. It's just like the eating, she explained. I put his usual clothes out in all the usual places, and he dresses without difficulty, singing to himself. He does everything singing to himself. But if he is interrupted and loses the thread, he comes to a complete stop. Doesn't know his clothes or his own body. He sings all the time. Eating songs, dressing songs, bathing songs, everything. He can't do anything unless he makes it a song.
Now this is also very interesting, because it's through something that he can access a world he cannot access, though his eyes still work. Now, his eyes still work, but there are other means of accessing things that are less direct.
While we were talking, my attention was caught by the pictures on the walls. Yes, Mrs. P said. He was a gifted painter as well as a singer. The school exhibited his pictures every year. I strolled past them curiously. They were in chronological order. All his earlier work was naturalistic and realistic, with vivid mood and atmosphere, but finely detailed and concrete. Then, years later, they became less vivid, less concrete, less realistic and naturalistic, but far more abstract, even geometrical and cubist. Finally, in the last paintings, the canvases...
And I'll leave that for the rest of you. But now notice again this business of seeing in Jonathan Pageau's illustration that he uses again and again and again with words that all of us can understand. But the point that Jonathan is trying to make, I think, probably alludes, even though all of the words are understood. And we commonly have this with videos. We talk. Do you get the point? Well, what exactly is the point? Where does that point reside? How does one get that point? It feels like revelation, because look at what we say when we get the point. Oh, a light came on. It's enlightenment. Now I see. But what exactly do you see? Now, when I was listening to this, I was thinking about reciprocal narrowing and reciprocal expanding. And I was thinking about the fact that it's the case that all of these things, now here in the case obviously of Dr. P, there's a neurological problem, which most of us don't have, but and so we manage in all of these ways, but there are cultures at work here. And the story that came to mind almost immediately was one that I've I've shared before.
Prologue. Look, there he is, Igagai, the spirit. Yes, I can see him. He's threatening us. Everybody, come see Igagai. Quickly, he is on the beach. I roused from my deep sleep, not sure if I was dreaming or hearing this conversation. It was 6:30 on a Saturday morning in August, the dry season of 1980. The sun was shining, but not yet too hot. A breeze was blowing up from the Mai River in front of my modest hut in a clearing on the bank. I opened my eyes and saw the palm thatch above me, its original yellow grain from years of dust and soot. My dwelling was flanked by 2 smaller pitaha huts of similar construction, where lived Ahwabisi, Pohoibehe, and their families. Mornings among the pitahas, so many mornings, I picked up the faint smell of smoke drifting from their cook fires, and the warmth of the Brazilian sun on my face, its rays softened by my mosquito net. Children were usually laughing, chasing one another, or noisily crying to nurse, the sounds reverberating through the village. Dogs were barking. Often when I first opened my eyes groggily coming out of a dream, a pitaha child, or sometimes even an adult, would be staring at me from between the paishuba palm slats that served as a siding for my large hut. This morning was different. I was now completely conscious, awakened by the noise and shouts of pitahas. I sat up and looked around. A crowd was gathering about 20 feet from my bed on the high bank of the Mai, and all were energetically gesticulating and yelling. Everyone was focused on the beach just across the river from my house. I got out of bed to get a better look, and because there was no way to sleep through the noise. I picked my gym shorts off the floor and checked to make sure that there were no tarantulas, scorpions, centipedes, or other undesirables in them. Putting them on, I slipped into my flip-flops and headed out the door. The pitahas were loosely bunched on the riverbank just to the right of my house. Their excitement was growing. I could see mothers running down the path, their infants trying to hold breasts in their mouths. The women wore the same sleeveless, collarless, mid-length dresses they worked and slept in, stained a dark brown from dirt and smoke. The men wore gym shorts or loincloths. None of the men were carrying their bows and arrows. That was a relief. Prepubescent children were naked, their skin leathery from exposure to the elements. The babies' bottoms were calloused from scooting across the ground, a mode of locomotion that for some reason they prefer to crawling. Everyone was streaked from ashes and dust accumulated by sleeping and sitting on the ground near the fire. It was still around 72 degrees, though humid, far below the 100-degree-plus heat of midday. I was rubbing the sleep from my eyes. I turned to Kohoi, my principal language teacher, and asked, "What's up?" He was standing to my right, his strong, brown, lean body tense from what he was looking at. "Don't you see him over there?" he asked impatiently. "Igagai, one of the beings that lives above the clouds, is standing on the beach yelling at us, telling us he will kill us if we go to the jungle."
Okay. Everybody in the town recognizes this being. Everybody in the town sees this being. Why can't the author of this book, Daniel Everett?
"Where?" I asked. "I don't see him." "Right there," Kohoi snapped, looking intently toward the middle of the apparently empty beach. "In the jungle behind the beach?" "No, they're on the beach. Look," he replied with exasperation. In the jungle with the pitahas, I regularly failed to see wildlife they saw. My inexperienced eyes just weren't able to see as theirs did. But this was different. Even I could tell that there was nothing on that white sandy beach no more than 100 yards away. And yet, as certain as I was about this, the pitahas were equally certain that there was something there. Maybe there had been something there that I just missed seeing, but they insisted that what they were seeing, Igagai, was still there. Everyone continued to look toward the beach. I heard Christine, my 6-year-old daughter, at my side. "What are they looking at, Daddy?" "I don't know. I can't see anything."
Now, put these two stories together. What's going on? Now, obviously, with Dr. P, he had a capacity to see which he lost. Everybody within this culture, he described the dress, he described the difference that the children, the pre-walking locomotion, the children scoot instead of crawl. And all of this, all these differences we kind of look at, like, yeah. But this seeing, nobody's going to accuse the village of lying. Nobody in the village is having an hallucination. What is going on?
Chris stood on her toes and peered across the river, then at me, then at the pitahas. She was as puzzled as I was. Christine and I left the pitahas and walked back to our house. What had I just witnessed? Over the more than 2 decades since that summer morning, I have tried to come to grips with the significance of how two cultures, my European-based culture and the pitahas culture, could see reality so differently. I could never have proved to the pitahas that the beach was empty, nor could they have convinced me that there was anything, much less a spirit, on it.
Now, Dr. Sachs, in a way, had some ways of sort of, okay, smell Oh, it's a rose, and he breaks into song, because song is sort of the means by which he connects to the reality. Place it on. Oh, it's a glove. You probably have a glove song.
As a scientist, objectivity is one of my most deeply held values.
Objectivity. Well, what exactly do you mean by objectivity? Is there a chair in the room? The Pitaha, I don't know if they have chairs. Could they see a chair? Or if they walked into a room, what would they see? Now, maybe if they saw me sitting in a chair, they would get a sense of it. I remember the missionary story in the Dominican Republic. We had a mission office in the capital city, and sometimes people would come from the countryside. Again, this is Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic, not a very big island. But you would let's say go into the bathroom, and you would see footprints on the toilet seat. Well, why on earth would there be footprints on a toilet seat? I've just traveled all throughout the Pacific Northwest and into Canada, and in all sorts of bathrooms here and there. Not once have I seen footprints on a toilet seat. Why not? Because a toilet is not something you stand on, because when you see it, you know exactly what it is for, and in fact, your whole body responds to all of these things. I remember when one of my cousins was young, and I was with my father and with my cousin, and it's kind of a funny story. We were at a campground because we were camping together. My father, not very good with children, left him to babysit my son, and came back and he tried to change his diaper. In the years that my father was raised, he never had to cook for himself or wash his own clothing. Those things were not lost on my growing up years, however. And so, then now in the care of my young cousin, who was at that point still in diapers, which my father didn't realize, the toddler basically made a point that pointed to the bathroom. Father thought, well, maybe he wants to go to the bathroom. Brings him right into the bathroom, and the first thing he does is, quite a quick little kid, puts his hands right in the middle of the urinal. And then my father realizes he's wearing a diaper, and my father had been fooled. And the rest of the family got a good laugh at that. But what did the toddler see in the bathroom? What do we see when we walk in a place? What can we see? What is there and what is not there? I listen to conversations about all sorts of things that are abstract in our culture, and in fact, we don't know what we're doing, because we're all trying to see and talk about things which are there or are not there.
If we could just try harder, I once thought, surely we could each see the world as others see it and learn to respect one another's views more readily. But as I learned from the Pitahas, our expectations, our culture, and our experiences can render even perceptions of the environment nearly incommensurable cross-culturally.
Now, what's interesting is that we're always seeing certain things that are not there, and we're talking about things that are not there. Where is classical liberalism? Where is wokeness? Where is Christianity? Where is cognitive science? But yet we handle all of these things, and in some ways we see all these things in a certain degree like we see a chair.
The Pitahas say different things when they leave my hut at night on their way to bed. Sometimes they just say, I'm going. But frequently they use the expression that, though surprising at first, has become one of my favorite ways of saying goodnight. Don't sleep, there are snakes. The Pitahas say this for two reasons. First, they believe that by sleeping less, they can harden themselves, a value they all share. Second, they know that danger is all around them in the jungle, and that sleeping soundly can leave one defenseless from attack by any of the numerous predators around the village. The Pitahas laugh and talk a good part of the night. They don't sleep much at one time. Rarely have I heard the village completely quiet at night or noticed someone sleeping for several hours straight. I have learned so much from the Pitahas over the years, but this is perhaps my favorite lesson. Sure, life is hard and there is plenty of danger, and it might make us lose some sleep from time to time, but enjoy it. Life goes on. I went to the Pitahas when I was 20.
Even life. This word that we see life, we think, although we get fooled sometimes. And we're not at all sure we can define what on earth we mean by that word, but there it is, and there we see, and there we do, and here we are.
26 years old. Now I'm old enough to receive senior discounts. I gave them my youth. I have contracted malaria many times. I remember several occasions on which the Pitahas or others threatened my life. I have carried more heavy boxes, bags, and barrels on my back through the jungle than I care to remember.
Now remember his story. He goes in there as a Christian missionary, and he loses his faith.
But my grandchildren all know the Pitahas. My children are who they are in part because of the Pitahas. And I can look at some of those old men, old like me, who once threatened to kill me, and recognize some of the dearest friends I have ever had, men who would now risk their lives for me. This book is about the lessons I have learned over 3 decades of studying and living with the Pitahas, a time in which I have tried my best to comprehend how they see, understand, and talk about the world, and to transmit these lessons to my scientific colleagues.
Okay, but here's the funny thing. It's kind of the same as the AI robot thing. Can you transmit what you learn to your other colleagues if they don't live in the village? Now, again, it's been interesting in this little corner of the internet. That is in many ways the point of postmodernity, is that, well, you don't have that lived experience. But do we have analogs? Do we have words? I mean, in some ways, the lived experience argument sort of wants to put everybody in a little bubble, but then, of course, if we're all in little bubbles, there's no point in talking to one another, and so you can, spare me the tirades or the manifestos or all of those things, because, of course, my lived experience is not yours, and to what degree do we not share them, and what levers are you going to use to open up our little bubbles, and what kind of imperialist are you, anyway, in bursting my bubble? Is that moral? Is that valid? Is that right?
This journey has taken me to many places of astounding beauty, and into many situations I would rather not have entered.
And think of that, beauty. Is beauty a thing that we see, but we know it? We certainly all use the word and have a sense that we're all on the same page when we're talking about it.
But I am so glad that I made the journey. It has given me precious and valuable insights into the nature of life, language, and thought that could not have been learned in any other way.
Yet he writes a book. But he's right in both counts, both to write the book and that I will never know the Pitaha like he does. I can read his book, I can learn a few things, I can even use it in a video to make an application with another book. But here we are.
The Pitahas have shown me that there is dignity and deep satisfaction in facing life and death without the comfort of heaven or the fear of hell, and in sailing toward the great abyss with a smile. I have learned these.
But now we see a little bit of his new faith, doesn't he? And he didn't get that from the Pitaha. He never saw the God on the beach. So what faith did he seize? What faith did he grasp at? What faith did he exchange for the one that he came to the jungle, the one that brought him to the Pitaha with?
These things from the Pitahas, and I will be grateful to them as long as I live.
Let's jump to another story.
The twins. When I first met the twins, John and Michael, in 1966 in a state hospital, they were already well known. They had been on radio and television, and made the subject of detailed scientific and popular reports. They had even, I suspected, found their way into science fiction, a little fictionalized, but essentially as portrayed in the accounts that had been published. The twins, who were then 26 years old, had been in institutions since the age of 7, variously diagnosed as autistic, psychotic, or severely retarded.
Well, one of the things that comes through beautifully in his end of the book, where it talks about the simple, is what Paul Kingsnorth talks about in terms of the machine. That, in fact, the world, this great network that we call civilization that has encompassed the globe since it first began to encompass the globe in 1492 with, as Charles Mann calls, the Columbian Exchange, is a system of reality, a system of being, a system of relating. It's, in fact, a system of seeing and valuing that we all must participate in. And there are those who, for one reason or another, cannot participate in it. And part of what's beautiful about the book is, in fact, the heart he has, that he wishes that the system, the machine, would value some of these strange, simple persons, and it does not. There's no place for them.
Most of the accounts concluded that, as idiot savants go, there was nothing much to them, except for the remarkable, documentary memories of the tiniest visual details of their own experience, and their use of an unconscious calendrical algorithm that enabled them to say at once on what day of the week a date far in the past or future would fall. This is the view taken by Stephen Smith in his comprehensive and imaginative book, The Great Mental Calculators. There have been, to my knowledge, no further studies of the twins since the mid-60s, the brief interest they aroused being quenched by the apparent solution of the problems they presented. But this, I believe, is a misapprehension, perhaps a natural enough one in view of the stereotyped approach, the fixed format of questions, the concentration on one task or another with which the original investigators approached the twins, and by which they reduced them, their psychology, their methods, their lives, almost to nothing. The reality is far stranger, far more complex, far less explicable than any of these studies suggest. But it is not even to be glimpsed by aggressive formal testing or the usual 60 minutes-like interviewing of the twins. Not that any of these studies or TV performances is wrong. They are quite reasonable, often informative as far as they go, but they confine themselves to the obvious and testable surface, and do not go to the depths, do not even hint or perhaps guess that there are depths below. One indeed gets no hint of any depths unless one ceases to test the twins, to regard them as subjects. One must lay aside the urge to limit and test and get to know the twins, observe them, openly, quietly, without presuppositions, but with a full and sympathetic phenomenological openness, as they live and think and interact quietly, pursuing their own lives spontaneously in their singular way.
Now this is where you get his, where he's trying to get, obviously, at the limitations of the scientific approach. And he does that quite vividly in other parts of the book, where he basically is saying that, I mean, the approach by which doctors are using or pursuing deficits. And in fact, in the second section of the book, he notes that if there are deficits, there are also excesses. And in these excesses, you discover some unusual things as well. I'm looking for a better picture of the twins that I had found before.
Then one finds there is something exceedingly mysterious at work, powers and depths of a perhaps fundamental sort, which I have not been able to solve in the 18 years that I have known them. They are, indeed, unprepossessing at first encounter, a sort of Tweedledum and Tweedledee, indistinguishable mirror images, identical in face, in body movements, in personality, in mind, identical too in their stigmata of brain and tissue damage. They are undersized, with disturbing disproportions in head and hands, high-arched palates, high-arched feet, monotonous squeaky voices, a variety of peculiar tics and mannerisms, and a very high degenerative myopia, requiring glasses so thick that their eyes seem distorted, giving them the appearance of absurd little professors, peering and pointing with a misplaced, obsessed, and absurd concentration. And this impression is fortified as soon as one quizzes them, or allows them, as they are apt to do, like pantomime puppets, to start spontaneously on one of their routines. This is the picture that has been presented in published articles, and on stage. They tend to be featured in the annual show in the hospital I work in, and in their not infrequent and rather embarrassing appearances on TV. The facts under these circumstances are established to monotony. The twins say, "Give us a date any time in the last or next 40,000 years." You give them a date, and almost instantly they tell you what day of the week it would be. "Another date," they cry, and the performance is repeated. They will also tell you the date of Easter during the same period of 80,000 years. One may observe, though this is not usually mentioned in the reports, that their eyes move and fix in a peculiar way as they do this, as if they were unrolling or scrutinizing an inner landscape, a mental calendar. They have the look of seeing, of intense visualization, although it has been concluded that what is involved is pure calculation. Their memory for digits is remarkable, and possibly unlimited. They will repeat a number of 3 digits, of 30 digits, of 300 digits with equal ease. This too has been attributed to a method. But when one comes to test their ability to calculate, the typical forte of arithmetical prodigies and mental calculators, they do astonishingly badly as their IQs of 60 might lead one to think. They cannot do simple addition or subtraction with any accuracy, and cannot even comprehend what multiplication or division means. What is this? Calculators who cannot calculate, and lack even the most rudimentary powers of arithmetic? And yet, they are called calendar calculators. And it has been inferred and accepted on next to no grounds that what is involved is not memory at all, but the use of an unconscious algorithm for calendar calculations. When one recollects how even Carl Friedrich Gauss, at once one of the greatest of mathematicians, and of calculators too, had the utmost difficulty in working out an algorithm for the date of Easter, it is scarcely credible that these twins, incapable of even the simplest arithmetical methods, could have inferred, worked out, and be using such an algorithm.
Now it's important to remember that they have to have an understanding of course, Easter, part of the reason that Easter is so difficult to calculate is because it's one of these ancient days that is dependent on Passover and on a lunar calendar, not on a solar calendar. And for that reason, Easter, just jumps all over the calendar all the time. And to then have an algorithm that can, easily calculate Easter just as such is remarkably difficult. That's the point. But they've also got to have the understanding of Easter in order to do this. Because if I were to ask you to calculate, such and such lunar day that is in some obscure tribe in a place that you've never been, well, you wouldn't have the concept for that tribe.
A great many calculators, it is true, do have a large repertoire of methods and algorithms they have worked out for themselves, and perhaps this predisposed W.A. Horwitz and others to conclude this was true of the twins too. Stephen Smith, taking these early studies at face value, comments, "Something mysterious, though commonplace, is operating here. The mysterious human ability to form unconscious algorithms on the basis of examples. If this were the beginning and end of it, they might indeed be seen as commonplace and not mysterious at all. For the computing of algorithms, which can be done well by machine, is essentially mechanical and comes into the spheres of problems, but not mystery."
Now, in this book, he often gets into the difference between the mechanical and the iconic, which very much comes to the fore in this little story.
And yet, even in some of their performances, their tricks, there is a quality that takes one aback. They can tell one the weather and the events of any day in their lives, any day from about their 4th year on. Their way of talking, well conveyed by Robert Silverberg in his portrayal of the character Melangio, is at once childlike, detailed, without emotion. Give them a date, and their eyes roll for a moment, and then fixate, and in a flat, monotonous voice they tell you of the weather, the bare political events they would have heard of, and the events of their own lives. This last often including the painful or poignant anguish of childhood, the contempt, the jeers, the mortifications they endured, but all delivered in an even and unvarying tone, without the least hint of any personal inflection or emotion.
Now, bear in mind, they have an IQ of 60. It's quite low.
Here clearly one is dealing with memories that seem of a documentary kind, in which there is no personal reference, no personal relation, no living center, whatever. It might be said that personal involvement, emotion, has been edited out of these memories, in the sort of defensive way one may observe in obsessive or schizoid types, and the twins must certainly be considered obsessive and schizoid. But it could be said equally, and indeed more plausibly, that memories of this kind never had any personal character, for this indeed is a cardinal characteristic of eidetic memory such as this. But what needs to be stressed, and this is insufficiently remarked on by their studiers, though perfectly obvious to a naive listener prepared to be amazed, is the magnitude of the twins' memory. Its apparently limitless, if childish and commonplace, extent, and with this, the way in which memories are retrieved. And if you ask them how they can hold so much in their minds, a 300-figure digit, or the trillion events of 4 decades, they say very simply, we see it. And seeing, visualizing of extraordinary intensity, limitless range, and perfect fidelity seems to be the key to this.
They see it. Anyway, say, well, where is it that you see it? Why do you use that word? They could not see the missionary, Daniel Everett, could not see the God on the beach. The man could not see his wife. He could hear her. He could bring her to reality via song, but he could not see her or apprehend her in that way. And these two see numbers.
It seems a native physiological capacity of their minds, in a way which has some analogies to that of which A. R. Luria's famous patient, described in The Mind of a Mnemonist, saw though perhaps the twins lack the rich synesthesia and conscious organization of the mnemonists' memories. But there is no doubt, in my mind at least, that there is available to the twins a prodigious panorama, a sort of landscape or physiognomy of all they have ever heard or seen or thought or done, and that in the blink of an eye, externally obvious as a brief rolling and fixation of the eyes, they are able, with the mind's eye, to retrieve and see nearly anything that lies in this vast landscape. Such powers of memory are most uncommon, but they are hardly unique. We know little or nothing about why the twins or anyone else have them. Is there then anything in the twins that is of deeper interest, as I have been hinting? I believe there is. It is recorded of Sir Herbert Oakley, the 19th century Edinburgh professor of music, that once taken to a farm, he heard a pig squeak and instantly cried G sharp. Someone ran to the piano, and G sharp it was. My own first sight of the natural powers and natural mode of the twins came in a similar spontaneous and, I could not help feeling, rather comic manner. A box of matches on the table fell and discharged its contents on the floor. 111, they both cried simultaneously. And then, in a murmur, John said, 37. Michael repeated this. John said it a third time and stopped. I counted the matches. It took me some time. And there were 111. How could you count the matches so quickly? I asked. We didn't count, they said. We saw the 111. Similar tales are told of Zacharias Daze, the number prodigy who would instantly call out 183 or 79 if a pile of peas was poured out, and indicate as best he could, he was also a dullard, that he did not count the peas, but just saw their number as a whole in a flash. And why did you murmur 37 and repeat it 3 times? I asked the twins. They said in unison, 37, 37, 37, 111.
Now notice 37, 37, 37, 111. You saw a chair in there, probably many of you, perhaps most of you. 3 37s is 111. Now, if you had asked me, what are 3 37s? It's 21, 90, 111. That's the way I would do it. 3 30s, 90. 3 7s, 21. 90 plus 21, 111. I would calculate it. We've already showed that they can't calculate, but they're seeing these things. What's going on? What is it with seeing and not seeing, whether it's a god on the beach, or whether it's a wife or a hat, or a foot, or a glove, or a rose?
And this, if possible, I found even more puzzling. That they should see 111, 111-ness in a flash was extraordinary, but perhaps no more extraordinary than Oakley's G sharp, a sort of absolute pitch, so to speak, for numbers.
But now pay attention here too, because the fallen box of matches, they are seeing matches as distinct from the floor. They are seeing matches as outside the box. They are seeing all of those things, all of that framework, all of that chairness, all of that matchness, all of that boxness, all of that is part of what they are seeing.
But they had then gone on to factor the number 111 without having any method, without even knowing in the ordinary way what factors meant. Had I not already observed that they were incapable of the simplest calculations and didn't understand or seem to understand what multiplication or division was? Yet now, spontaneously, they had divided a compound number into 3 equal parts. How did you work that out? I said, rather hotly. They indicated as best they could in poor, insufficient terms, but perhaps there are no words to correspond to such things, that they did not work it out, but just saw it in a flash. John.
Now again, they're seeing things. Now you might say, well, what was the god on the beach or not? Was the foot the shoe? But they're seeing things, but they're seeing in a very different way. Strangely, they're still seeing, but what is this seeing about?
John made a gesture with 2 outstretched fingers and his thumb, which seemed to suggest that they had spontaneously trisected the number, or that it came apart of its own accord into these 3 equal parts by a sort of spontaneous numerical fission. They seemed surprised at my surprise, as if I were somehow blind, and John's gesture conveyed an extraordinary sense of immediate felt reality. Is it possible, I said to myself, that they can somehow see the properties, not in a conceptual abstract way, but as qualities, felt, sensuous, in some immediate concrete way? And not simply isolated qualities, like 111ness, but qualities of relationship? Perhaps in somewhat the same way as Sir Herbert Oakley might have said a third or a fifth. I had already come to feel, through their seeing events and dates, that they could hold in their minds, did hold, an immense mnemonic tapestry, a vast or possibly infinite landscape in which everything could be seen, either isolated or in relation. It was isolation rather than a sense of relation that was chiefly exhibited when they unfurled their implacable, haphazard documentary. But might not such prodigious powers of visualization, powers essentially concrete and quite distinct from conceptualization, might not such powers give them the potential of seeing relations, formal relations, relations of form, arbitrary or significant? If they could...
Now, again, arbitrary or significant. What is the distinction between those? Because if, in fact, you're in a classroom and you want to know how to factor 111, seeing comes very usefully. If you want to teach the children how to factor, they're of absolutely no help at all. But what is arbitrary and what is significant?
See 111ness at a glance, if they could see an entire constellation of numbers, might they not also see at a glance, see, recognize, relate, and compare in an entirely sensual and non-intellectual way enormously complex formations and constellations of numbers?
Now, almost all of the political, religious, theological debates that we are so deeply admired in are all about seeing.
We are in the midst of a culture war.
That's an interesting thing to see. I've been reading this trilogy about the war in the Pacific, and there are bombs, and there are bunkers, and there are ships, and there are aircraft carriers, and there are dead, and there is Iwo Jima, and there are atomic bombs. There are all of these things. Well, that's a war. Well, we're in a culture war. Well, what on earth is that? Well, that was those words were coined. Was it James Davidson Hunter who coined those words? I don't remember. It could have been.
Although it started in the universities, particularly in France, through the open portal of the damnable Yale, and then into the rest of the institutes of higher education, it is not only the faculty and administrators of our colleges and universities who are at fault. Those charged with the privilege and responsibility of running the corporate world are lining up to kowtow at the DIE altar. Diversity, inclusivity, and equity.
Now, notice all the seeing we're doing. We're seeing all over the place. We simply swim in it. Even if you can't, well, does Uncle Sam exist? Well, I see him at the courthouse. I see him at the monuments in Washington, D.C. I see him on the Civil War uniforms that say us, or is it us, or is it U.S.? I see. We live in a world of seeing all sorts of things. We think nothing of it, and yet we have very limited grasp on exactly how we see and what we see and what's going on in this strange world.
A ridiculous, even disabling power. I thought of Borges's Funes. We, at one glance, can perceive 3 glasses on a table. Funes, all the leaves and tendrils and fruit that make up a grapevine. A circle drawn on a blackboard, a right angle, a lozenge.
A chair.
All these are forms we can fully and intuitively grasp. Ireneo could do the same with the...
And of course, Dr. P, well, that's exactly what he was struggling with. Maybe if you sang a grape song, he would see it. If he smelled the flower, he would see it. Or maybe he never sees it at all.
Stormy mane of a pony with a herd of cattle on a hill. I don't know how many stars he could see in the sky. Could the twins, who seemed to have a peculiar passion and grasp of numbers, could these twins, who had seen 111 nests at a glance, perhaps see in their minds a numerical vine, with all the number leaves, number tendrils, number fruit that made it up? A strange, perhaps absurd, almost impossible thought, but what they had already shown me was so strange as to be almost beyond comprehension. and it was, for all I knew, the merest hint of what they might do. I thought about the matter, but it hardly bore thinking about. And then I forgot it. Forgot it until a second spontaneous scene, a magical scene, which I blundered into completely.
I love how this story unfolds. I have this thought. I mean, I can see that in myself. So I have this thought, I have this idea. Wow, what do we do? But then you get distracted, and then you get busy, and then suddenly something else happens.
By chance. This second time, they were seated in a corner together, with a mysterious secret smile on their faces, a smile I had never seen before, enjoying the strange pleasure and peace they now seemed to have. I crept up quietly so as not to disturb them. They seemed to be locked in a singular, purely numerical converse. John would say a number, a six-figure number. Michael would catch the number, nod, smile, and seem to savor it. Then he, in turn, would say another six-figure number, and now it was John who received and appreciated it richly. They looked at first like two connoisseurs, wine-tasting, sharing rare tastes, rare appreciations. I sat still, unseen by them, mesmerized, bewildered. What were they doing? What on earth was going on? I could make nothing of it. It was perhaps a sort of game, but it had a gravity and an intensity, a sort of serene and meditative and almost holy intensity, which I had never seen in any ordinary game before, and which I certainly had never seen before in the usually agitated and distracted twins. I contented myself with noting down the numbers they uttered.
Now, note they're usually agitated and distracted. Well, what does that mean? Well, distracted. Distraction. Tell me what distraction is. Isn't it a difference of focus and attention? Well, what should focus and attention be upon? Well, it's relevance realization, right? And one of the things I was thinking about in my hours of driving and listening to audiobooks and a little bit of relevance realization, I was explaining some of these things that I talk about in my videos to my wife, who watches none of my videos, nor would she care to. The telotic nature of relevance realization. Things are relevant as to their telos, as to their meaning, as to their end, as to their purpose. There's a reason all those things come together. They're agitated and distracted. Well, now they're not agitated and distracted. They're focused on, for them, is their joy, is what they see as glory.
The numbers that manifestly gave them such delight, and which they contemplated, savored, shared in communion.
I love the words used. Contemplated, savored, shared in communion. It's practically religious.
Had the numbers any meaning, I wondered on the way home? Had they any real or universal sense, or, if any at all, a merely whimsical or private sense, like the secret and silly languages brothers and sisters sometimes work out for themselves? And as I drove home, I thought of Luria's twins, Lyosha and Yura, brain-damaged, speech-damaged, identical twins, and how they would play and prattle with each other in a primitive, babble-like language of their own. John and Michael were not even using words or half-words, simply throwing numbers at each other. Were these Borgesian or Funesian numbers? Mere numeric vines or pony manes or constellations, private number forms, a sort of number argot, known to the twins alone? As soon as I got home, I pulled out tables of powers, factors, logarithms, and primes, mementos and relics of an odd, isolated period in my own childhood, when I too was something of a number brooder, a number seer, and had a peculiar passion for numbers. I already had a hunch, and now I confirmed it. All the numbers, the six-figure numbers, which the twins had exchanged, were primes. That is, numbers that could be evenly divided by no other whole number than itself, or one.
And it's amazing here, because these twins haven't been to school. I don't know at what age I learned about prime numbers. I don't know what age I paid any attention to prime numbers at all. Probably only at the, at least initially, only at the insistence of a teacher.
They somehow seen or possessed such a book as mine? Or were they, in some unimaginable way, themselves seeing primes in somewhat the same way as they had seen 111ness or triple 37ness? Certainly they could not be calculating them. They could calculate nothing. I returned to the ward the next day, carrying the precious book of primes with me. I again found them closeted in their numerical communion, but this time, without saying anything, I quietly joined them. They were taken aback at first, but when I made no interruption, they resumed their game of six-figure primes. After a few minutes, I decided to join in and ventured a number, an 8-figure prime. They both turned towards me. then suddenly became still, with a look of intense concentration and perhaps wonder on their faces. There was a long pause, the longest I'd ever known them to make. It must have lasted a half-minute or more, and then suddenly, simultaneously, they both broke into smiles.
They've arrived at communion. They are worshiping.
They had, after some unimaginable internal process of testing, suddenly seen my own 8-digit number as a prime. And this was manifestly a great joy, a double joy to them. First, because I had introduced a delightful new plaything, a prime of an order they had never previously encountered. And secondly, because it was evident that I had seen what they were doing, that I liked it, that I admired it, and that I could join in myself. They drew apart slightly, making room for me. A new number playmate, a third in their world. Then John, who always took the lead, thought for a very long time. It must have been at least 5 minutes, though I dared not move and scarcely breathed, and brought out a 9-figure number. And after a similar time, his twin, Michael, responded with a similar one. And then I, in my turn, after a surreptitious look in my book, added my own rather dishonest contribution, a 10-figure prime I found in my book. There was again, and for even longer, a wondering still silence. And then John, after a prodigious internal contemplation, brought out a 12-figure number. I had no way of checking this and could not respond because my own book, which as far as I knew was unique of its kind, did not go beyond 10-figure primes.
Because who would want to? Unless it was your religion, unless it was your God, unless it was your worship.
But Michael was up to it, though it took him 5 minutes. And an hour later, the twins were swapping 20-figure primes. At least I assumed this was so, for I had no way of checking it. Nor was there an easy way in 1966, unless one had the use of a sophisticated computer. And even then, it would have been difficult. For whether one uses Eratosthenes' sieve or any other algorithm, there is no simple method of calculating primes. There is no simple method for primes of this order, and yet the twins were doing it. Again I thought of Daza, whom I had read of years before in F.W.H. Myers's enchanting 1903 book, Human Personality. We know that Daza, perhaps the most successful of such prodigies, was singularly devoid of mathematical grasp. Yet he, in 12 years, made tables of factors and prime numbers for the 7th and nearly the whole of the 8th million, a task which few men could have accomplished without mechanical aid in an ordinary lifetime. He may thus be ranked, Myers concludes, as the only man who has ever done valuable service to mathematics without being able to cross the ass's bridge.
Okay. Valuable service to mathematics.
What is not made clear by Myers, and perhaps was not clear, is whether Daza had any method for the tables he made up, or whether, as hinted in his simple number-seeing experiments, he somehow saw these great primes as apparently the twins did. As I observed them quietly, this was easy to do because I had an office on the ward where the twins were housed, I observed them in countless other sorts of number games or number communion, the nature of which I could not ascertain or even guess at.
Number communion.
But it seems likely or certain that they are dealing with real properties or qualities, for the arbitrary, such as random numbers, gives them no pleasure or scarcely any at all. It is clear that they must have sense in their numbers, in the same way perhaps as a musician must have harmony. Indeed, I find myself comparing them to musicians, or to Martin, also retarded, who found in the serene and magnificent architectonics of Bach a sensible manifestation of the ultimate harmony and
That's from a previous story.
order of the world, wholly inaccessible to him conceptually because of his intellectual limitations. Whoever is harmonically composed, writes Sir Thomas Browne, delights in harmony and a profound contemplation of the first composer. There is something in it of divinity more than the ear discovers. It is an hieroglyphical and shadowed lesson of the whole world, a sensible fit of that harmony which intellectually sounds in the ears of God. The soul is harmonical, and hath its nearest sympathy unto music. Richard Wollheim in The Thread of Life makes an absolute distinction between calculations and what he calls iconic mental states. And he anticipates...
Okay, he's gonna go through this. I wanted you to get the sense of seeing, and now maybe I'll give you a sense of the machine and where this story goes, and it's not a happy place.
He speaks here of a synthetic perception which transcends analysis and is the unanalyzable essence of all musical sense. He compares such tones to faces.
He goes off into music and comparing it to math and a little bit of that. And we'll get to where I'm going in a minute.
And speculates that we may recognize them in somewhat the same personal way. In brief, he half suggests that musical tones, and certainly tunes, are, in fact, faces for the ear, and are recognized, felt, immediately as persons or personeities, a recognition involving warmth, emotion, personal relation. Particularly fascinating and fundamental problems are raised by the perception and recognition of faces, for there is much evidence that we recognize faces, at least familiar faces, directly, and not by any process of piecemeal analysis or aggregation.
One thing and then ask you a couple more things. So this Izoot distinction is even more peculiar when you look deep into the neuroscience of perception. Okay, so one of the most influential books I ever read was An Ecological Approach to Visual Perception. And it's a classic text on perception and a very sophisticated one. And I don't think it has no pretensions to mysticism of any sort. And so that's kind of interesting, given the conclusion. And the conclusion of the author is that what we see aren't facts or objects. We see meanings. So, for example,
now think about that with respect to Dr. P. Think about that with respect to the village and the God and what the missionary cannot see. Think about that with respect to the twins and 111 and prime numbers. They're seeing meaning.
6-month-old who crawls towards a visual cliff, which is a plate of glass stretched over or placed over a falling off place. The 6-month-old will stop. He won't crawl. 7 months, I don't remember the exact age. He won't crawl.
So when I was in Canada, when I went to the Columbia ice fields, when you buy the rather expensive ticket, I blessed the Canadian economy in a significant way over the last few weeks. But so if you want to go up onto that glacier, and actually it's really cool to go up into that big, enormous, very unique 6-wheel vehicle to get up there. It's like something out of Lost in Space, this enormous trail. Then you go out on the glacier for a half hour and you slip and slide around, and I felt like I was back in Michigan, and it was fun and it was cool, and we took selfies and tasted the fresh glacier water and all of that. And then you go on this skywalk, which they have one over in the Grand Canyon, but they have one over this valley that's quite near to the Columbia ice fields, and you go out there and it's just disturbing. And they say, "Oh, wipe your feet before you go out there." Why? To keep the glass clean? I'd rather have it dirty because it feels troubling. And then, you're just a little nervous, perhaps, if you're afraid of heights, about walking on this glass. And that's, of course, the whole attraction of the thing. And everybody's feeling a little weird, and people are sort of playing with the danger. And then people for whom it makes nervous. I saw one couple, the boyfriend or the husband, trying to coax his beloved out onto it, but I noticed that the cement that the woman was standing on is just as much on the cantilevered steel as the very thick glass that holds her. In other words, it's just because she couldn't see that she was just as much dependent on the engineering of this place as you would see when you're standing on the glass. Well, there it is. We see meaning
all across that piece of glass.
Right.
He doesn't see cliff and infer falling off place. He sees falling off place. And there's a condition called neglect.
Okay, now that's just it. He sees falling off. Now, we're not conscious of that because in some ways this seeing is pre-conscious. And in the case of these severely impaired twins, they're just seeing. That's all they're doing. And they can or cannot see the God, and he cannot see his wife. He can hear his wife. He can smell his wife. He can hear he can smell the rose. He can maybe put on the glove. But this seeing, we see meaning.
Neglect, which is characteristic of certain people who have prefrontal lobe damage. It's not neglect, it's called utilization behavior.
Yeah.
And these people lose the ability not to act in the presence of a meaningful object. So if they walk down the hall and the door is open, they will go through the door. if you put a cup in front of them, they cannot stop but pick it up because they don't see cup and infer drinking. They see drinking object directly. And so even that distinction is deceptive in a very fundamental sense because it's predicated on the idea that what we see are meaningless objects and that we lay an overlay of meaning on top of that. And it's not by no means obvious at all that that's how we see.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason why it's been so difficult to make machines that can see and act in the real world, because the object world is not simple. And that value structure that you're describing, that value structure, right? That is embedded in all of our perceptions in ways that we are only beginning to understand scientifically.
Poor Sam's not going to go anywhere with this.
This, as we have seen, is most dramatically shown in prosopagnosia, in which, as a consequence of a lesion in the right occipital cortex, patients become unable to recognize faces as such and have to employ an elaborate, absurd, and indirect route, involving a bit-by-bit analysis of meaningless and separate features. So it seems to be with those who love numbers. These two become recognizable as such in a single, intuitive, personal "I know you." The mathematician Wim Klein has put this well. Numbers are friends for me, more or less. It doesn't mean the same for you, does it? 3,844? For you it's just a 3 and an 8 and a 4 and a 4. But I say hi, 62 squared. I believe the twins, seemingly so isolated, live in a world full of friends, that they have millions, billions of numbers to which they say hi, and which, I am sure, say hi back. But none of the numbers is arbitrary, like 62 squared. Nor, and this is the mystery, is it arrived at by any of the usual methods or any method so far as I can make out. The twins seem to employ a direct cognition, like angels. They see directly a universe and heaven of numbers.
No, very subtle. They see directly. Well, there's a biblical reference in there. Then we'll see him face to face. Well, we can't see him. Well, why can't we see God? Well, God is a super thing in the sky. Show me this God? Well, show me your numbers. Well, I can stack up cups and say there are 3 cups. Are you seeing 3? How exactly is any of this working?
And this, however singular, however bizarre, but what right have we to call it pathological, provides a singular self-sufficiency and serenity to their lives, and one which it might be tragic to interfere with or break. This serenity was in fact interrupted and broken up 10 years later, when it was felt that the twins should be separated for their own good.
Should be separated for their own good. Well, what goal do we see that they must strive for? What thing ought they? Well, they are a burden. They are a burden on the state, or a burden on their family, or a burden on the state of New York.
To prevent their unhealthy communication together, and in order that they could come out and face the world in an appropriate, socially acceptable way, as the medical and sociological jargon had it.
Now we begin to see the machine.
They were separated then in 1977, with results that might be considered as either gratifying or dire. Both have been moved now into halfway houses and do menial jobs for pocket money under close supervision. They are able to take buses, if carefully directed and given a token, and to keep themselves moderately presentable and clean, though their moronic and psychotic character is still recognizable at a glance. This is the positive side. But there is a negative side too, not mentioned in their charts, because it was never recognized in the first place. Deprived of their numerical communion with each other, and of time and opportunity for any contemplation or communion at all, they are always being hurried and jostled from one job to another. They seem to have lost their strange numerical power.
They no longer worship. They no longer go to their little church of 2 that Oliver Sacks was a visitor in, where they could contemplate the vision of the prime numbers. They now have... There's another story in this wonderful little book where a man finally pleads, I need to go to church. And then he goes to church and he's got all of Bach in his head, and he knows exactly when they should. And he helps this little church in New York that follows Bach, helps them get it all exactly right. But to the rest of the world, he's an idiot. So Now these two. Well, now they can take a bus. Now they can sweep a floor if they don't bother anybody too much.
And with this the chief joy and sense of their lives. But this is considered a small price to pay, no doubt, for their having become quasi-independent and socially acceptable. One is reminded somewhat of the treatment meted out to Nadia, an autistic child with a phenomenal gift for drawing. Nadia, too, was subjected to a therapeutic regime to find ways in which her potentialities in other directions could be maximized. The net effect was that she started talking and stopped drawing. Nigel Dennis comments, "We are left with a genius who has had her genius removed, leaving nothing behind but a general defectiveness." What are we supposed to think about such a curious cure? It should be added, this is a point dwelt on by F.W.H. Myers, whose consideration of number prodigies opens his chapter on genius, that the faculty is strange and may disappear spontaneously, though it is, as often, lifelong. In the case of the twins, of course, it was not just a faculty, but the personal and emotional center of their lives. And now they are separated. Now it is gone. There is no longer any sense or center to their lives. On the other hand, should this discussion be thought too singular or perverse, it is important to note that in the case of the twins studied by Luria, their separation was essential for their own development, unlocked them from a meaningless and sterile babble and bind, and permitted them to develop as healthy and creative people. Postscript. When he was shown the manuscript of this paper...
then he goes into some more math. What a curious thing is life, isn't it? What we see, what we don't see, what our attention does. In the UK, someone asked me to preach in a church and they want me to preach about worship. And I've learned a lot about worship in the conversations of this little corner on the internet in terms of what we see. Many songs sort of stream through my head that I have sung in church. We see the Lord high and lifted up. We see the Lord. Ye who has eyes to see, let them see. So there it is. These are the things that roamed through my head, continue to roam through my head. And I hope that my little playing of some of these clips and some of these videos will be for each of you a provocation, not just so that you may see different things and have better sight, but what are eyes given for? Strange world that we live in when we're told we may not see God and we must not see God. And the Bible seems to go back and forth on that because, of course, Moses' face glows because he's been with the Lord. But when Moses asked to see his face, he's put in the cleft of the rock, and they go back to back while the Lord announces his name. You can hear him, but you can't see him. I think of C.S. Lewis's greatest novel, collaborated with Joy Davidman, quite likely, till we have faces. The reason we can't see him is because we have no face. And a face, yes, a face. We can't see it because we don't have eyes to see. So I don't know how many more videos will be coming out. I'll be leaving on a family trip, and there might be time to make videos. There might not be. I don't know how much time I'll have for audiobooks when I go. I just don't know what the next few weeks brings. But I hope I have provoked something in you that is worthwhile and helpful.